Hello, Bible Geeks. Ryan Schumacher here. We're here for week 4 of the Old Testament in Today's World. And today we are going to be talking about the theology of the law. So this whole series we've been trying to explore what are we seeing from God revealed in the Old Testament. And some of the elements that are crucial to the theology of the Old Testament we've already gone over. We've gone over who the person of Yahweh is as revealed in the Old Testament. We've talked about covenant and the importance of how God used covenants to communicate to people. And then we've also looked at the theology of creation, what humans are for. One of the other really important points, though, is the role that the law plays and what we can know about God and what's sort of being taught theologically about the law. And so what we're going to cover today, the way that I'm approaching this one is kind of as an extension of last week's covenant series. So last week we talked about the promissory covenants, but we talked about there were a few different kinds of covenants. There was one that was a vassal treaty. And so we're going to look at ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties. And we're going to link that back to the law and see what that ancient Near Eastern context helps us understand. So we're going to see the nature of ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties, how the Sinai covenant is like that, why this one was different, and then what does it mean for Christians today? All right, so starting with the definition, again, we're going to remind ourselves of the definition last week. So a covenant is a lifelong, unchangeable, solemn agreement between two designated parties in which one or both make an oath-bound pledge to perform a specific ongoing commitment or else suffer the wrath of God. So remember, some of the key points here, lifelong. So as long as we both shall live, there's no provision for amendments. There's an oath-bound pledge that is sort of the center of it all. And the ones we looked at last week were ones where God made promises. Here, we're going to be looking at the one that's different, which is the Sinai covenant, which is the vassal treaty. So the Noahic covenant, the only person who took the oath was God. The Abrahamic covenant, the only person who took the oath was God. Likewise, David, likewise, the new covenant. The Sinai covenant, though, humans are a party to it. Humans actually take a covenantal oath. So, in these three different kinds of covenants, remember this, the vassal covenant, as we described it, was a stronger party imposing solemn obligations on a weaker party, to which the vassal agrees. So remember, there's no covenant if there's no agreement. So the vassal is the term for the lesser party. The suzerain is the word for the superior party. And so when it says imposing solemn obligations, so typically in the ancient Near Eastern context, this would be tribute and loyalty in exchange for protection. And then there would be blessings and curses for obedience and disobedience. So we will see that as we work through this. So the features of a vassal covenant. So in an ancient Near Eastern vassal covenant, it's going to start with a preamble. It's going to name the parties in it. And as we saw last week with the Enuma Elish a bit, the ancients were kind of verbose. I completely speculate that, look, when you're chiseling on stone, you got no takebacks. I can't tell you how many times I've written something and deleted something on these slides and gone back to try and fix that. If I was chiseling it on stone, I think there would be many more words. So there's going to be this preamble that's going to go on for a while, talking about who the parties are. Then you're going to have a section about the history between the two parties. And it's going to describe everything kind of leading up to that point in the relationship. A little bit about one party, a little bit about other party, and how they relate to each other. Then there's going to be the covenant stipulations. So what are the terms of the covenant? This would be, if it's tribute, we're going to talk about tribute. If it's protection, we're going to talk about protection, etc. So what is being agreed to? There's going to be the invocation of witnesses, and then there's going to be the oath along with the blessings and curses. Those two things tend to go together. So the oath will be, if I party A perform this, then insert blessings. And if I party A don't perform the terms of the covenant, then, curses. So you kind of see those two things go together. So this is the rough outline of an ancient Near Eastern vassal covenant. Now, in the ancient Near East, a vassal covenant usually involved monetary tribute in exchange for protection or the absence of annihilation. So the vassal would give monetary tribute, and the suzerain would provide protection and would abstain from punishing them, if you will, or taking over the city, etc. Now, though covenants are, they're described as lifelong binding arrangements, it's obvious, and we said this last time, it's not impossible to prevent somebody from violating the covenant. So what it really means when we say it's solemn, binding, lifelong is that there are consequences if you don't follow through in your obligations. So this is where the blessings and curses come in. Now, not all curses or blessings are equal. For instance, if you have a minor infraction, let's say you short pay your tribute, that may be exchanged with a minor punishment. Maybe they'll, burn a farm down, just to be crabby about it. Major infractions like refusing the tribute altogether or allying with somebody else could invoke the full covenant curses. And typically what that would be is the obliteration of the vassal by the suzerain. Of course, if you've allied yourself with a stronger suzerain, well, then the two suzerains fight. But now we're starting to get a little bit into actually some of the things that were part of the Israelite history, weren't they? All right. Here's something I really want to make sure I drive home. Once the curses are fully carried out, the covenant is over. There's no more covenant. It's done. Neither party is bound to it anymore once the full covenant curses, however they are described, are invoked and brought to bear. So if a covenant has, curses that say don't result in the annihilation of one of the parties, not that was common in the ancient Near East, but if that happened, well, once the full curses are executed, you're off the hook. There's no more covenant anymore. So this is going to end up being important when we start looking through the theological lens at the Sinai covenant and how it pertains to Christians today. So I just wanted to make this statement, very boldly up front. That's why I chose the bold font. Before we get there, that the curses mean the end of the covenant. So here's an example. We have the example from 1300 BC between Marcellus II and Dupitesub of Amurru. And I know exactly where those places are. I really don't. But so here's a picture of a covenant chiseled on stone. So let's look at this. It opens up, these are the words of the son Marcellus, the great king, the king of Hatti land, the valiant, the favorite of the storm god, the son of Suppilulius, Suppilulius. Well, okay, that's a mouthful. The great king, the king of Hatti land, the valiant. So then you go into, and then it goes on to describe Dupitesub. We're not going to read through the whole thing as long. So then you have the historical introduction. So Azurus was your grandfather, Dupitesub. He rebelled against my father, but submitted again to my father. And when your father died in accordance with your father's word, I did not drop you. Since your father mentioned to me your name with great praise, I sought after you, and it blah, 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 blah. But so this isn't the covenant stipulation. This is giving history. This is the genre of these treaties. We see this kind of over and over in the historical record. So then we've got the covenant stipulations. Here's your specific ongoing commitment. The tribute, which was imposed upon your grandfather and your father, they presented 300 shekels of good, refined, first-class gold, weighed with standard weights. You shall present them likewise. Do not turn your eyes to anyone else. Now, remember, covenants are between two specified parties. The covenant doesn't transfer to successors. So this is a new covenant with Dupitesub and Marcellus, who's basically saying, okay, now that you're king, here, we're going to enter into a new covenant, you and I. And in this case, the terms of that covenant are being imposed on Dupitesub, which ostensibly he had the opportunity to say no, like to the flames with you, but he's probably not going to do that if Marcellus is stronger. But the main point being this covenant has to be made again. Then there's the invocation of witnesses. So the gods and goddesses of Amuru land, all the olden gods, Naras, Napsaris, Minki, Tushi, Amuki, Amizadu, Alalu, Anu, Antu, Apantu, Elil, Nilil, etc., etc. Let these be the witnesses to this treaty and the oath. Interesting, I shouldn't have gone too quickly. The great sea, heaven, earth, winds, and the clouds. Remember, all things are the gods, but so these are the celestial and terrestrial deities. They are to be witnesses to the treaty and the oath, so calling divine witnesses. And then you have the oath-bound pledge. So the words of the treaty and the oath that are inscribed on this tablet. Should Dupiteseb not honor these words of the treaty and the oath, may these gods of the oath destroy Dupiteseb together with his person, his wife, his son, grandson, his house, his land, together with everything that he owns. But if Dupiteseb honors these words of the treaty and the oath that are inscribed on this tablet, may these gods of the oath protect him together with his person, his wife, his son, grandson, his house, and his country. So here we have the divine witnesses. Remember, suffer the wrath of God as one of the covenant definitions. Here you go. The oath is being taken. The blessings and curses are of divine wrath. Of course, how would the gods enact that wrath? Well, Mercilius's gods would get angry at Dupiteseb, and the gods would fight it out through proxy war. Remember, wars between two tribes or wars between the gods. And then, having this chiseled on stone was also something that would be kept in the territory for Dupiteseb, probably near the palace. So it's very clear that this covenant was in fact entered into. Okay, so all of that, what's the relevance of that? Well, guess what else is structured like this? And I've said it before in previous classes, so you might know the answer, but this structure is also the macro structure for the book of Deuteronomy. And at this point, it's hardly disputed anymore that the book of Deuteronomy is in the genre of the Hittite Vassal Treaty. So the suzerain being Yahweh and the vassals being Israel. So remember what I've said. This is being spoken to them in their idiom. It was written for us, but it's not written to us, in the words of Dr. Walton. That we have to understand culturally what the significance would be for them. They are Yahweh's vassals. They have solemn obligations, and there are blessings for obedience and there are curses for disobedience. And so this is the kind of thing that made sense in their culture. And there's reasons why understanding it that way helps us understand the role of the law today for us as Christians. So we're going to get into that. But I just want to take a brief digression to sort of prove this out. We're not going to read through the whole book of Deuteronomy, but you have the preamble at the beginning. You have the historical context through the first few chapters. Then you have the very long covenant stipulations from chapter 4 through 27. You get the famous Deuteronomy 28 blessings and curses that you also see in Leviticus 26. Chapter 29 is the oath, and then you have the invocation of witnesses in chapters 30 and 31. So, at the beginning here, the preamble, so this is the very beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness on the plains opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, Dizahab. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord had commanded to speak to them, and on and on. This is just the first couple verses. Historical context. So if you're familiar with the opening of the book of Deuteronomy, you see a lot of emphasis on Kadesh Barnea. When they were to send out the spies to go in the land, God told them to go. And then the spies came back and said, OMG, they're giants. We're too afraid. And then God said, no, you should go. And then they said, nuh-uh. And so then they were condemned to wander in the wilderness until the disobedient generation passed. It also records Moses being denied entry into the promised land. Instead, Joshua is the one who is going to be able to enter the promise or enter the promised land. So vassal treaties don't always involve happy histories. Clearly, God is not happy with what's going on here. And now there is an imposition of the vassal obligations. So this is where you see provisions for proper worship. This is where you see things about the order of society. So what are the institutions? The kings, prophets, priests, judges. We have the things that we're familiar with about civil law that are in Deuteronomy about what happens. Okay, if this person kills this person, but it happens under these circumstances, then there's this. And if this person is this person's father, but that person dies, then what happens to the all of those kind of civil procedure kind of things. You see purity laws and cleanliness laws. So that's about if somebody does this, they are unclean. They have to wait days, weeks, months, hours, whatever it is. Maybe show themselves to the priest before they can return to the community. Then there are interpersonal laws. So what happens if somebody steals? What about the treatment of workers? So this was their law. There was no other civil law. This was the code of the orderly society in Israel. So what comes next are the blessings and curses, the famous Deuteronomy 28. So opening chapter 28, if you will only obey the Lord your God, all of these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you. Interesting language. You'll be lavished with these blessings. Things like plentiful harvest, there's going to be peace in the land, and in particular, God's presence will be among them. The promise in Leviticus 26, I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people, is kind of the culmination of the blessings. It is the final blessing before you go into the curses. So this is what you see in the book of Joshua. You see covenant obedience. For the most part, Achan wasn't great, but for the most part, you see blessings. And in fact, towards the end of the book of Joshua, it talks about how obedient he and they were. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And then chapter 28, verse 15, but if you will not obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments and decrees, which I am commanding you today, then all of these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. So you will be lavished with curses. Things like poor harvest, war, famine, the devastation of Israel being the culminating one. This is the kind of thing that you see in the book of Judges. So if you ever wondered, Joshua versus Judges, what it's thematically, Joshua is the success of taking the land during a time of covenant obedience, and then you see the escalation of the covenant curses through the cycles of disobedience in the book of Judges. Chapter 29, you get the oath. You stand assembled today, all of you before the Lord your God, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God, sworn by an oath, which the Lord your God is making with you today, in order that he may establish you today as his people, and that he may be your God, as he promised you and as he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So if you're wondering, is this a covenant? Yeah. And who's swearing an oath? Well, you're going to enter into a covenant of the Lord your God, sworn by an oath, which God is making. That's true. God is promising. God's part of it. But as you see elsewhere in here, but you also see this in a little bit later, Exodus 19 and Exodus 24, the people also take the oath as well. And then finally, we see some parallel here to the Hittite treaty. The witnesses, I call upon heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. So heaven and earth are witnesses, just like the sea and the earth in the Hittite treaty. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him, for that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land and that the Lord swore. You may live in the land that the Lord swore to give your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, so like the law, the book of Deuteronomy, and everything we think of as the Torah, that is culminated here. Again, Moses is speaking to them before they're about to go into the land. It is in the form of a vassal treaty. All right, so I could think maybe perhaps if you're like, great, I believe you, Ryan. Cool. Who cares? Like, fine. So it's a Hittite vassal treaty. Does that mean anything for us today? So here's going to be my response to that. I'm going to ask, have you ever had someone ask you something like, how could God impose all of these hundreds of laws on people and expect them to keep it? There's so many laws, 613, I think. Is God so petty as to impose just like a rule book on people with all this complexity? What's more, the laws just seem very strange to us. Why would the Almighty God, the creator of the entire universe, care if I eat lobster? Because shellfish are one of the foods that are unclean. Or if I wear a shirt that's 50-50 polyester cotton, because the law says that you should not have clothes made of more than one fabric. Doesn't it seem strange to you? And then finally, you may have heard this one, we don't follow all these commandments today. We don't. So there's a theological question. Are we violating God's commandments? Or, this is another one you'll hear. We just selectively invoke the ones that meet our particular prejudices to dislike certain things that the Bible says, but then ignore the things that we like that are prohibited by the Bible. So we can invoke things to prohibit things we don't like, but we can disobey the law when it's convenient to us or when we don't like what it says. So these are common things that the law is criticized for. And I think if you understand the ancient Near Eastern context here, it can help us grasp the theology of the Sinai covenant. And then it can help answer these questions for us. So that's why I do this up front. We went through maybe 20 minutes or so of setup here in order to have the credibility then for me to make some of the arguments I'm going to make about the application of the law, what it is, why it is what it is. So let's try and look at it through ancient eyes and see what we can understand and grasp, and then how do we bridge that context back to us today. So let's go after the first question. So is it fair for God to impose these 613 laws? And, how could there be any sort of expectation that we would keep all of them? All right. So let's go back. What's one of the rules of a covenant? This is why we did all the setup. Covenants were entered into by, do you remember? By choice. If it's imposed, it's not a covenant. That's something else. But covenants, of which this is a choice to enter into. And as we see, the Israelites, did they enter it by choice? Yes, they did. You can see that in the covenant offer and then the covenant ratification, Exodus 19, Exodus 24. So if we look at the covenant offer initially, Exodus 19, this is when they initially come to Sinai before the 10 Commandments. So then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the Israelites." That's what God told Moses. So this is the offer of a covenant right here. And I call this the big if. You've seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure from among all the peoples on the earth. So there is an obligation that's being imposed on Israel with the big if to obey the commandments. That would be the cleanliness laws, the holiness code, the moral laws. And if they do, there's going to be plentiful harvest. There's going to be peace. They're going to be in God's presence. They're going to be the special treasure, the royal priesthood, the holy nation. We see this in the blessings and curses, Deuteronomy, Leviticus. And if they don't, like we've already said, poor harvest, war, famine, your enemies will rule over you. You will no longer have the land. That was one of the big promises. So you see this in the back half. Notice the blessings in Leviticus 26 go through 12 verses, and the curses go through 20 verses. This is pretty typical. Ancient Near Eastern style too. The blessings are much shorter than the curses. They're far more interested in the curses. Okay, and then all the people responded together. Interesting, Moses goes down the mountain and tells them, and then all the people responded together, "We will do all that the Lord has spoken." So there's the agreement. God didn't unilaterally impose the law. Israel took a solemn oath of agreement to it. You can see, and this went all the way through the ratification ceremony, the animal sacrifice. Remember, we talked Genesis 15. Animals split. The torch passes through. God has taken the oath. Well, Israel now goes through the process of, if we break the oath, then let what has happened to these animals happen to us. Look, Exodus 24, beginning verse 4. Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. So all the words are written down. He sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed oxen as offerings of well-being to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he dashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. So he wrote down all the words of the Lord, verse 4. He took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. So now they heard all of the words of the Lord. And they, the people, said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So there is the oath being taken. And Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, see the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So then the blood of the covenant was on the people, and it was also on where? The altar. The altar, of course, being the stand-in for the party God. So, unlike all the other covenants here, the animals were offered in sacrifice, and then the blood was sprinkled on the people, the blood of the covenant, which is their solemn sworn oath, that they would obey all that the Lord has spoken. So, when it comes down to these laws, what we're actually seeing is that God didn't impose the Sinai law on people. The Israelites agreed to it. There was the opportunity to decline to enter into the Sinai covenant. Would it have been a good idea? No, I wouldn't think so. But this was a voluntary thing on the part of the Israelites. They agreed to follow these laws. These laws were, and we'll come back to this, but it's important to note here too, covenants are between two specific named parties. This law was written down by Moses and then brought and read to the people. And then the people made the oath and then went through the ratification with the blood. Did the Canaanites do that? No, they didn't. Did the Egyptians do that? No, they didn't. Did the Assyrians do that? No, they didn't. This was a specific named party, Israel, and a specific named party, Yahweh, who entered into a covenant with each other. The Sinai covenant is a covenant with Israel. It is not a universal moral code for all people at all time. It wasn't even a universal moral code for all people then, during the same time. This was a covenant agreement between Yahweh and Israel. I can't emphasize that enough, because sometimes we think of it like this is, there's a particular point of view called theonomy, God's law, theo, God, nomos, law, that would say that the law of God was revealed here and that it's binding on us today. And we should structure our society around it. And there's many reasons why that is not true. But perhaps the strongest is the fact that this is covenantal language, and covenants were between two parties. And so this is between God and the Israelites. All right. So God did not impose the law on them. They were agreed upon. So now let's go to the question of why such strange laws. So I want to, maybe in class tomorrow I'll say, all right, so what's your favorite Levitical law? What are the things we've all heard? Like, you can't have, more than one crop in one field. You're not allowed to eat shellfish. Rabbits chew the cud or whatever. Childbirth and menstruation makes you unclean and you can't, approach the temple, even though those are like completely normal and sort of necessary things. So I feel like, when we approach it, we often think of it as like, there's just 613 laws and it's kind of random. I would like to demystify this. Let's look at the infamous book of Leviticus. Let's break it down into what it covers. And I think you're going to start to see the structure a bit more and how it all fits together. And I'll be able to give some answers. Probably not fully satisfied, but some answers to why we have such strange laws or what appear to us as strange in the Old Testament. So Leviticus, first of all, what does it even mean? Well, Levite, that would be the tribe of Levi. These are the priests. It's Levite stuff. What you see in Leviticus, especially the beginning, the Levites are the priests. They served at the tabernacle. They're responsible for the sacrificial system. They determine cleanliness, uncleanliness. They preside over the festivals, etc. This is the handbook of the priests. So the priests have this handbook with all the laws and what they're supposed to do and their role in it. So it's the code of laws for Israel. Included in that are things in Exodus and Deuteronomy. There is no separate civil law aside from this. Everything is Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, but mainly Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and parts of Exodus. So here's the outline of the book. If you've ever wondered what Leviticus is about, here it is. So the first 10 chapters are all priestly stuff. So it's about the sacrificial system. It's about the installation of priests. Like we said, it's Levite stuff. So there's some very specific things about the Levites. Chapters 11 through 15 then include the first, lists of things that we kind of associate with the book of Leviticus. So you have the cleanliness code here. Which animals are clean and unclean? When you've had a child, what do you have to do to become clean again? Skin infections. What to do about mildew. All sorts of bodily discharges. So that's about cleanliness. Then you have in the middle the instruction for the Day of Atonement. And then picking up in chapter 17 through chapter 26, you then have the moral law. So this is not about cleanliness to approach the temple, but it's about decorum, like how you were supposed to act. And then finally, there's valuations for vows and tithes. So this separation between the cleanliness code and the moral law is going to become important as we go through. But let's talk about the clean versus unclean. This is where I think we find a lot of the things that we find strange. Not all of them, but a lot of the things that we find strange. So what's up with cleanliness? So Leviticus 15, sort of the very end. Remember, so Leviticus 15:31 is almost the very end of the cleanliness section. And it says, you must keep the Israelites from their uncleanness. Now, who's this written to? The priests. So that's the audience. You, the priests, must keep the Israelites from their uncleanness so that they do not die by defiling my tabernacle that is among them. Interesting. So death could be a consequence of defiling the tabernacle. And you are not to defile the tabernacle. But God's speaking some pretty serious stuff here about what it would mean for someone who is unclean to approach the temple. Unclean things here, and not my definition, God's here, desecrate the tabernacle of God. And as long as one is unclean, you are not allowed to participate in worship. You may not approach the temple. You cannot engage in the sacrifices either. So the cleanness of the people is, and this is going to come out through the next few slides, but is related to what it takes to be in the presence of Yahweh as his priests, which is what the commission was about, as bearers of his image. It's again theology of humans, whom his blessing would come through to the world. So that's how the Abrahamic blessing is being worked out through the people Israel and Sinai. So the cleanness is related to these things. And if you don't, well, then you're going to get the curses, and it's not going to be very fun. The curses were not fun. So as far as this defiling of the tabernacle, it is not something that we're used to. So we're going to take a circuitous route here, and we're going to talk a little bit about ancient Near Eastern context that might illuminate this a little bit more. Because the idea of sacred space is not an idea that really permeates our culture much these days, especially in the American society, where we think about God-given rights of the individual, and that the government is given consent to govern by the people. The White House is called the People's House. So there is not this idea that there is built into at least our governmental structure, which has tons of influence on the way that we think and relate to each other. There's not this idea of the sacred nearly as much. So the sacred and the profane is a much more powerful idea in the ancient world. And so we're going to take a look at some of that a little bit and how that influences, that cultural influence plays out in the Bible. All right, so let's talk about sacred space. Let's talk about temples. A temple, an ancient temple, is a place of divine residence. It's not like the way we think about church buildings today. Church buildings are built for worship. Temples were places where heaven and earth literally met. And the central shrine was both heaven and earth at the same time. It was a portal through which the heavenly realm intersected with and broke through into the terrestrial realm. It was the place where the God was. So we come to church, we gather together it's a place of gathering for us for the sake of worship. That is not the case for a temple. A temple is the house of the God. It is where the gods live. And so that was sacred space. Michael Hundley, in his book Gods and Dwellings, writes, the temple was the site of a semi-permanent theophany. Theophany is a manifestation of the presence of a God. It's the appearance of a God. When you think of like the Shekinah glory coming down in Exodus chapter 40, when you think of the call of Isaiah in Isaiah 6, or the call of Ezekiel, with the transfiguration, the appearances of God. So the temple was the site of a semi-permanent theophany. So imagine the transfiguration being something that you could just go look at if you wanted to. It's kind of like preserved there. It's a little bit of an overdrive, but it's getting the idea along, the semi-permanent theophany. One that would remain, my emphasis, as long as the deity remained content. It was controlled and isolated. It was the controlled and isolated environment that enabled divine presence on earth and mediated contact between the resident deity and its human servants. Okay, and remember the human servants bit. This is great symbiosis. But it was the controlled and isolated environment. Very controlled by the priests. And we'll see why it was so controlled. Now, at the center of the temple was an image of the god. It was a crafted cultic piece. Cultic just meaning it was a part of ritual. And it was the vessel for the divine essence. The image, when it was made, here we have Shamash, the Mesopotamian sun god. When the image was made, there were elaborate rituals conducted to make sure that the god was happy with the image, that the god would be pleased by the image that was created, because the image would have its eyes and ears and nose open at the inauguration of the temple so that the spirit of the god could enter the image, that the god would live inside the image of the god in the temple that would be at the center, the intersection of heaven and earth. So just kind of as a slight digression here, here's a picture of a temple, the ziggurat of Ur in Babylon, and you can see staircases that are going up. And the staircase is going up where? Remember the ancient cosmology, the three-tiered universe, is going up to the heavens. Who lives in the heavens? The gods. This is not so that they could reach the heavens. It's so that the heavens could reach down to them. That this was the ziggurats were to create the intersection of the heavens and the earth, and so that the God could come down from the heavens. And so they are inviting the God to enter the image, and then at this intersection of heaven and earth, and then the God enters the image, and now the temple is consecrated. Now remember, there are no laws of physics. Everything here is the gods. Right? We talked about that. There's no such thing as natural, supernatural distinction. The temple is where you went to make your sacrifices, food, money, music, whatever. The things that you brought, the things that the God needed in order to be pleased and therefore to sustain your community. So you approached the presence of the God. Again, this is the God's dwelling place. The image has been made. It's been consecrated. The divine essence has now entered at this intersection of heaven and earth into the image, the semi-permanent theophany. The God is there. You are approaching the literal presence of God with your offering at the temple, and you are, quite literally, praying that your offering will be acceptable. Now remember this great symbiosis idea. Okay, you have to please the God, you have to satisfy the needs of the gods, and then the gods will take care of you. And if the gods don't like what you're doing, then they're not going to be happy. So The ancient Near Eastern gods cared very deeply about purity because, and these are John Walton's words, they were, quote, persnickety and petty. Purity was designed to meet their exacting demands, my emphasis, so that they would not express their inherently temperamental nature. Remember the gods, the creation of the universe, where it's gods fighting, multiple ancient Near Eastern myths, it's divine war that results in the creation of the world. The gods were pretty human, put it that way. They were, capricious and temperamental, and they could get angry, very angry. Pure people and pure offerings were your best chance at pleasing the gods. You had to minimize the likelihood that the god was going to reject your offering, be upset, and then lash out at you. So the purity of your offering and the purity of you as the person were very important to ensuring the acceptability of your sacrifice before the god. And then the deity would dwell among you happily if the god was pleased. And I was like, the saying, happy God, happy life. So this is how the temples worked. That the god was in the temple, intersection of heaven and earth, the physical presence of the god. And so you approached the god with your sacrifice. That was your, remember, the gods were created humans because their labor was too great, but they're expecting to be the recipients of that labor. So they better be happy with what you're bringing. And if they're not, then they're going to make you pay. So this is the theology of the temple. Now, the Israelites had a temple as well. And there are some similarities. The presence of God was in the temple, the Shekinah glory. There were specific rituals. Certainly some differences. Yahweh is not in a symbiotic relationship with humans, and so you're not feeding Yahweh. A lot of the things were actually offered to the Levites. But the main thrust of the Sinai covenant, in terms of the culmination of the blessings, Leviticus 26:12, is in this tripartite promise. And it says, I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people. That is the prime prize for obedience under the Sinai covenant. I will be with you. And when did the presence of God come to be with them? So that would be Exodus chapter 40. So after the Exodus 34, 35, I think, you start going through all of the ornate descriptions of what the tabernacle is going to look like. And it needs to be this made of gold and this made of linen and the Ark of the Covenant and all of that. So once they have the tabernacle, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This is the God entering the temple. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on each stage in their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, before the eyes of all the house of Israel at each stage of their journey. So this is the inauguration of the tabernacle, the dwelling of God among his people after the covenant ratification. So Yahweh has conferred a holy status on his people. They are the royal priests. They are his treasured possession. They are a holy nation, holy, set apart, different from everybody else. And in order to live holy, different than everybody else, the ones through whom the blessing will come in the world, the priests, the mediators between God and humanity, these qualities of holiness need to be evidenced in their lives. They are, after all, the image bearers of Yahweh. So purity here matters for one reason that is pretty easy for us to understand. He cares about damage done to ourselves. So things against murder or lying or theft or whatever, these are things that don't make us reflect holiness and don't make us reflect God, and they're damaging to us. But God also cares about purity because he cares about how we identify ourselves as his people. And this one is easier to understand as an ancient Near Eastern person. And it's differentiating Yahweh's people from the other gods. It's holiness. That's why this is sometimes, the cleanliness is sometimes called the holiness code. And here's just a few examples. In the ancient Near East, there were some temples that had fertility rites. You never miss church. In contrast, intercourse makes a couple unclean until evening, and they cannot approach the temple. In the ancient Near East, there was worship of the dead. And under Yahweh's law, even touching a dead body makes you unclean. So there's an association. These things aren't sinful. Like, you have to bury your dead. You're going to have intercourse with your spouse. I mean, otherwise there's going to be no humans. So it's not that these were sinful or bad things, but there is an association in the ancient Near East between those things and God that Yahweh was saying is not me. And that is not the holiness. That is not what I am the God of, and you will not worship me in that way. The ancients worshipped many gods. Here's another way that this came around. And so this is where we start to see, like, you must not crossbreed two different kinds of livestock. You must not sow your fields with two different kinds of seed, or put on a garment made of two different kinds of material. Why is this starting to make sense now? Why these laws are there? The Israelites were to be set apart. They are different. They are holy. They are Yahweh's people. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And so as one, they are going to live their lives in this sort of mono framing, that they will not crossbreed their animals. They will not sow their fields. If you go by the fields, they're going to be uniform blocks. Their garments are going to be one kind of material. They're going to demonstrate the superiority and the oneness of Yahweh in that way. They're going to avoid things that could be seen as participating in worship of Yahweh that is not the worship of Yahweh at all. It is the worship of other gods. So there's no confusion as to whether or not Yahweh wants fertility rites, because you're unclean. You stay away from the temple. That's not what approaching the temple is about. You were burying the dead. Okay, that's fine. Good on you. You don't approach the temple. That's not what worship is about. So being clean or unclean reflected one's status at the tabernacle or the temple. It was whether or not you were in a holy enough status, a separate enough status, to participate in sacrifice and worship. So being unclean is a temporary state. This often happened during the normal course of life, like we talked about. Even when doing good normal things, childbirth is another thing that makes you unclean. Menstruation is something that makes you unclean. These are normal things. They're going to happen. They should happen. It's just not what the worship of Yahweh is about. And so that's what made you unclean. Now, we're not sure why all of the laws were given. I can't give you an ancient Near Eastern pagan worship practice example for shellfish. I don't know that. But many of them do appear to be contrasting Yahweh with the Canaanite religion. I think, to me, this also seems to be separating some of the carnal human aspects of our existence from the divine presence. That God is not human. And so, like, all the bodily issues that we're talking about. Some people mention that this is God cleverly couching sanitation principles, things that people just should know about how to avoid disease, into the laws. I struggle with this one a little bit. It's not universally true of the laws. And the Bible doesn't give that as a reason. It's speculative. Could have something to do with that. But I don't feel very strongly on that. I wouldn't rest too hard on that argument. I believe it's much more about right worship. So, when the blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience were outlined for Israel, no distinctions made between the cleanliness laws and the moral law. Both of these could equally, violations of cleanliness, violations of moral law, could produce curses. Obedience would produce blessings. So it was vital, and here's now where this hopefully all comes together. It was vital for the holy status of Israel to maintain their covenant status as the royal priesthood dwelling with God, that they kept all of the law. Otherwise, Yahweh is going to up and leave. The divine presence will no longer be with them. The execution of the covenant curses will come. So my second point here on the, why all these strange laws. These laws are specifically designed to keep God around. Because God will dwell with you. I will dwell with you, be your God, and you will be my people if there's blessing. And you will be abandoned, cursing. So that you have to keep the divine suzerain pleased. They wanted life, not death, blessing, not cursing. So these laws were about how God's chosen people, Israel, were to maintain the holy order necessary to be in the presence of Yahweh, reflect Yahweh into the world on Yahweh's terms, not worship him like a pagan god, but worship him as he would have it, as he describes what holy and right worship is. So then there's the question, do these laws matter today? Because this is about approaching the temple, right? Now, I would say, just to go point first here, some of them matter today, but not others. We're going to have to look at the distinctions between the cleanliness and the moral law. There's a clear break. We looked at that outlined in Leviticus between the clean and unclean stuff, chapters 11 through 15, and then 17 through 25 on the moral law. So if we look at some of the things in the moral law, you see forbidden kinds of sacrifices. You see prohibitions on certain sexual relationships. There's things about how to live a holy and just life. It's a very loose outline, but that's where you find love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19. Avoiding pagan religious practices, holiness laws for priests, Israel's festivals and holy days. So you see these things in the moral law. The most severe crimes in the Torah, false worship. So if you're making sacrifices to other gods or worshiping other gods, that ain't going to work. Sabbath breaking, blasphemy. So if you're worshiping them properly, that's not going to work. Cursing one's parents is a severe crime. Murder. Some sexual practices are categorically excluded. Kidnapping and false testimony in court. Does anybody notice a certain pattern here? It would seem that the most severe crimes in the Torah parallel the commandments. So the sowing of seed of two different kinds is not parallel with murder or cursing one's parents. Just as a brief digression on cursing one's parents, in the Decalogue, it says, honor your father and mother so that you will have life in the land. It's like, why is that? I feel like if there's one commandment that actually sticks out to us the most in our present day, honoring your father and mother is one that seems more just like advice as opposed to a moral imperative in our society. And the way that it comes across in the commandments is so that you will have life. It is because it was through the parents that Torah was taught, that you had to listen to your elders in order to know the requirements of Torah. And you had to honor those requirements. So anyway, yes, the most severe crimes in the Torah parallel the commandments. So I just wanted to share that. I thought that's cool. So do these laws matter today? So remember, a covenant is an agreement between two parties. And who are the parties of the Sinai covenant? Yahweh and Israel. I made that point earlier. So is that Yahweh and us? No. And does the New Testament say that we must obey the law? Paul was actually very clear about this. No, we're not under the law of Moses. Okay, cool. So we're not under the Sinai covenant. Therefore, we can forget the law. We can ignore it, right? It was for them. It's not for us. And we're free of all of it. Of course not. But why? Theologically, why? And this is going to help distinguish between the ones that we follow and the ones that we don't. Jesus quotes from the law very often. The Sermon on the Mount is tightly bound up in the law and actually escalates the requirement. You've heard it said, but I say to you, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I say, don't resist the evildoer. Love thy neighbor and hate your enemy. I say, love them both. Don't murder. I say, don't even hate your neighbor or be angry at them. Don't commit adultery. I say, don't lust. Jesus is one-upping the moral requirements of the law. And the character of God is unchanging. It's reflected in the holiness required in the Sinai law. God is jealous. He abhors idol worship. That doesn't change. We can't start worshiping idols. God cares for the poor. Jesus enacted this for us. This shows up in the apostles as well. God has high standards and demands of his covenant people. There are requirements and obligations imposed on us. But what about the cleanliness laws? Well, remember, what was the point of the cleanliness laws? It was about to determine who could approach the temple. Does the temple still exist today? No, it does not. And in fact, that's worth going into that, because we're now going to see part of the ancient Near Eastern covenant understanding bring this full circle. Remember that when there's covenant curses, when the curses are executed, the covenant's over, right? And which biblical covenant had curses associated with it? Sinai. Were the curses executed? Yes. When? Can you think of when? When were the covenant curses executed? The answer is the Babylonian exile, the sacking of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the loss of the land, the king was no longer on the throne, and they had to leave, and others were ruling over them. This is the culmination of the curses of the law. Ezekiel chapter 10 just talks about the dramatic imagery here. Ezekiel 10, then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house, that's the temple, stopped above the cherubim. Cherubim lifted their wings and rose up from the earth in my sight as they went out with the wheels beside them. They stopped at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. The glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the temple. Covenant ratification, the guest of honor arrives, inhabits and indwells the tabernacle. 1 Kings, the temple is built. I think it's 1 Kings 8. The glory of the Lord fills the temple. And then here, the glory of the Lord goes out of the temple. And then what happens? The sacking of Jerusalem. Subsequently, Jerusalem is sacked. They no longer have God present with them. They don't have their land. They don't have their king. They don't have their temple. They don't have their peace. Their enemies are ruling over them. All of the covenant curses have come to bear at the Babylonian exile. And so what does that mean about the covenant? Now I'm just trying to get you to repeat after me the things I've been saying. The curses are in effect, and therefore the covenant is over. And remember, and this is the point I'm hoping is going to drive home that I'm not just making this all up. They rebuilt the temple, but what was different? The Shekinah glory never returned to the temple. God never re-inhabited that second temple. The building was there, but the glory of the Lord never came back. And they were trying to figure out, why hasn't the glory of the Lord come back? We must still be being disobedient. And so this was the cultural context for the obsession over Sabbath breaking in particular. And the priest trying to find out, why haven't we been obedient enough to get the relationship restored with God again? But the covenant was over. So what does this mean about whether or not the terms of the covenant are binding on us today? It's really only insofar as they're reiterated in the new covenant. After all, there's no temple even for us to go approach. The covenant was broken. So it is obviously reflecting the character of Yahweh and what right worship of Yahweh looks like. And that comes through in what Jesus is telling us and in the commands that are found in the New Testament and the New Covenant. But not all of them. It's only really the parts that are reiterated as part of the New Covenant that are binding on us today. And some of them are explicitly repudiated, right? Peter has the vision of the sheep coming down with the animals, and God says, go, Peter, kill and eat. And he says, Lord, I can't, no, I don't eat any unclean things. And God's like, what, I have declared, clean, don't call unclean, now eat. And it says and thus he made all animals clean. Right there. It's declared. So there's a changing of the role of the holiness and ceremonial law, because the temple is not there, the covenant is broken, and indeed God is repudiating some of those things, as well as the sign circumcision. That's Galatians. But there's other things. The moral law is just as much, if not more so, operative. So Jesus upholds the moral law, but not the cleanliness laws related to the temple. So the food laws, Sabbath, including the Gentiles. Remember, the Sinai covenant was only with the Israelites. Jesus includes the Gentiles in the covenant. So point number 3, we are not parties to the Sinai covenant. So we are not bound by the Sinai law, except to the extent that Sinai principles are reiterated in the new covenant, which of course is quite often. So hopefully this is a nice understanding of the theology of the law that we see. And you can hopefully start to see when you read the Old Testament, the mentality that pervades of obedience, disobedience, blessing and cursing, and how that works its way through the history of Israel. So anyway, I hope this was helpful and clarifying. Thanks for listening as always, and God bless.